I had just returned from flying emergency relief supplies to a wildfire zone when I found a fluorescent pink notice taped to my Jeep windshield. The wind hadn't even cooled the hood down yet. Parking violation, it read in loopy handwriting that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. The offense being parked in my own driveway. Right underneath it in permanent marker someone had scribbled, "Try reading the rules, Soldier Boy." I didn't even need to flip it over. Only one person in this neighborhood signed notes with hearts over their eyes. Karen. That was the moment I decided if she didn't want me parking my Jeep, fine. I'd just land the helicopter instead. It all started 2 weeks earlier when I bought the Jeep. Nothing flashy, just a rugged olive green Wrangler with a tow winch, all-terrain tires, and a bumper sticker that said, "I brake for medevac." I barely had it 3 days before I got my first taste of HOA tyranny. Karen, our self-declared dictator of a board president, strutted up my driveway in her pastel pink tracksuit like she was storming Omaha Beach, clipboard in one hand, iced latte in the other. She tapped on my driver's side window like she was issuing a citation to a criminal. I rolled it down, curious. She leaned in, fake smile plastered on her Botox-tight face, and said this neighborhood has an aesthetic standard and that thing doesn't meet it. I thought she was kidding at first. I genuinely chuckled. That was a mistake. Karen's eyes narrowed like I'd insulted her poodle. She snapped a photo of my Jeep, jotted something on her notepad, and walked off without another word. By dinner, an email from the HOA had arrived. Subject: urgent compliance issue. They wanted me to relocate the unsightly vehicle from view, suggesting I store it in a covered garage or appropriate off-site facility. I replied with a simple question. Does my driveway count as unsightly or just my service record? That response didn't go over well. The next morning, my mailbox had a thick envelope filled with HOA code violations I'd never seen before. Some were laughable. No visible decals, no utility racks, no parked vehicles over 72 inches high for more than 4 hours. It was like they'd invented rules overnight just to get under my skin. But I wasn't the only target. Talking to the neighbors, I learned Karen had fined a retired firefighter for parking his vintage Chevy pickup too close to his curb, and even demanded a veteran down the block repaint his American flag-themed mailbox because it clashed with the community color palette. Most of my neighbors were good people, teachers, small business owners, a few retirees, but they all had the same look in their eyes when Karen's name came up, exhausted and quietly terrified. She wielded power with a clipboard and a phone line to the towing company like she was running some suburban version of a police state. And the worst part? She wasn't even elected. She'd just been around long enough, steamrolled enough people, and scared off the rest until nobody ran against her anymore. That kind of power breeds a very special kind of entitlement. Still, I figured I could ignore her. I wasn't trying to pick a fight. I parked the Jeep as far into the driveway as I could, nose practically kissing my garage door. I even turned it around so the decals weren't visible from the street. It didn't matter. One night I came back late from a medevac drill and found the Jeep gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen. I was halfway dialing 911 when I noticed a fresh pink slit fluttering on the ground where my front tire had been. HOA vehicle removal, emergency lane obstruction, my driveway, my property. They towed my vehicle while I was away on active duty drills. That was when something in me snapped, not in a rageful way, but in a surgical, deliberate kind of way. I walked into my garage, past the workbench and storage shelves, and unlocked the steel locker in the back corner. Inside, my framed commendations, patches, and an old laminated flight map from my time in the service. I pulled out my license, still current, and smiled. If Karen didn't want a Jeep in the driveway, maybe she'd enjoy the roar of rotor blades instead. I didn't tell anyone my plan, just quietly started working on a few home improvements. I releveled part of my backyard under the guise of installing a meditation zone, bought some synthetic landing mats, and had them shipped in pieces to avoid suspicion. When Karen asked, I said it was for yoga. She wrinkled her nose and said, "Just make sure it doesn't attract bugs." That week, I drove to the regional airstrip where my buddy Marcus worked maintenance for private aircraft. We got to talking about FAA regulations, low-impact helipads, and the legalities of takeoff and landing on private land in a semi-rural zone like ours. Turns out, as long as I wasn't interfering with wildlife flight paths or other homes and had the proper permits, I could absolutely land a helicopter in my yard. So I filed for a short-term experimental air operations permit, listed myself as a medical responder with air evac background, provided copies of my certification, and walked out of City Hall with a signed document that made one thing very clear. I wasn't breaking the law. I was just flying above it. By the time the Jeep was finally returned, dinged up, scratched, and with a broken side mirror, I wasn't angry. I was focused. I filmed the damage, documented the retrieval process, and uploaded a calm, matter-of-fact video online titled HOA illegally towed my vehicle while I was serving, so I'm taking another route. The internet ate it up. Hundreds of comments poured in with stories of petty HOA dictators, parking wars, and revenge suggestions. One guy offered to send me landing lights. Another said, "Land that bird and let Karen know what altitude authority really looks like." I hadn't even brought the chopper in yet, and I already had a fan club. But I wasn't doing this for attention. I was doing it to prove a point, that when bullies write their rules in ink, the best way to fight back is to show up with a different kind of pen, one with a rotor blade. And so, as I stood in my garage, helmet in hand, the early morning sun slicing across the floor, I heard the faint rhythmic chop of blades in the distance. My ride was inbound, and I was about to give Karen a wake-up call she'd never forget. The morning after I finalized the permit, I stepped out onto my lawn, coffee in hand, watching the dew shimmer on the synthetic landing mat I'd spent the last few nights installing. It looked like a simple piece of lawn decor to most, a large, neat circle of leveled turf with weather-resistant edging and discrete LED lights embedded along the perimeter. To Karen, it probably still looked like a suspiciously symmetrical yoga mat. That assumption worked in my favor. She didn't know I designed helicopter landing zones in far worse terrain during my service. Compared to that, my backyard was practically a red carpet. A few neighbors walked by and gave me curious glances. Most of them had caught wind of the Jeep drama by now. I gave them friendly waves, playing the long game. I didn't need to rally a mob. I just needed a clear airspace and a solid touchdown point. Karen, on the other hand, was ramping up. She'd taken to doing slow laps around the block in her golf cart, clipboard clutched like a rifle, sunglasses perched on the tip of her nose as if scanning for insurgents. At one point, she even drove up to the edge of my property line and snapped a photo of me raking the landing zone. I looked up, smiled, and waved. She didn't wave back. Later that day, a folded flyer appeared in my mailbox. Special Emergency HOA Meeting, 7 p.m., topic, Unauthorized Property Modifications and Possible Aviation Threats. The phrase aviation threats made me laugh so hard I almost dropped my sandwich. I could practically hear her panic, imagining the chaos of her past utopia shattered by the sound of rotor blades. It was almost poetic. I decided to attend the meeting, dressed neatly, polite as ever. The community room was already packed. Residents had shown up in numbers I hadn't seen before, probably because word had spread about Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. I took a seat near the back, not saying much. Karen stood at the front like she was commanding a courtroom, laying out a slideshow of blurry, surveillance-style photos, me digging, laying mats, even a zoomed-in shot of me holding a clipboard. She spoke as if I were building a missile silo. "This is a safety issue," she declared. "We cannot allow military-style operations in a peaceful, family-oriented community. The children could be traumatized, the pets might bolt, the property values could plummet." A man in the second row raised his hand. Didn't he serve in the Air Force or something? Army, I corrected gently, standing, and technically, I flew medevac in the Army's aviation branch. There was a murmur of approval. Karen's face pinched like she'd bitten into a lemon. Another resident, a retired nurse named Diane, chimed in, "So wait, you're saying he's qualified to land helicopters, and you're worried about kids being traumatized by what? Noise? The HOA has the right to protect neighborhood character. Karen snapped. I held up a copy of the air operations permit. And the FAA has the right to permit qualified pilots to land on private property under specific conditions, which I meet. Everything I've done is within my legal rights. There was a moment of silence. Karen turned redder than the HOA logo. She tried to pivot, rambling about noise ordinances and possible air pollution, but the crowd wasn't buying it. I didn't need to say another word. I'd let the permit and her own paranoia do the talking. After the meeting, a few neighbors came up to shake my hand. Some offered to help paint lines for the pad or help with camera coverage for landing. One guy even said his teenage son was interested in aviation and asked if he could watch the first landing. I agreed, telling him it might be sooner than he thought. Over the next few days, I tightened up the setup. I installed a windsock, a small weatherproof radio beacon, and marked out a safe viewing area for anyone curious. I even ordered a collapsible, landing zone active sign, just to drive the point home. I didn't want drama. I wanted precision. I wanted everything clean, clear, and above reproach. Then came the call from my old flight buddy Trevor, who ran a private air logistics company nearby. He had an old Bell 206 sitting in the hangar. Not pretty, but legal, reliable, and light enough to touch down without kicking up debris. I asked him if he could swing by this weekend. His answer was short. You fueling it, or should I? I fueled it. The night before the landing, I parked the Jeep squarely in the middle of my driveway again, just for old time's sake. Karen didn't disappoint. Around midnight, I saw her outside, pacing in front of it, phone pressed to her ear. I watched from the upstairs window, sipping hot cocoa like it was a scene from a sitcom. Eventually, she stormed off, defeated for the moment. By sunrise, everything was ready. I wore my flight jacket, not to flex, but because it was chilly and sentimental. The neighbors started gathering casually, pretending to do yard work or walk dogs. A few brought lawn chairs. Karen emerged from her home like a general inspecting a battlefield, eyes darting, face tight. She tried to pretend nothing was happening, but her neck kept craning toward the sound that was slowly rising in the distance. The unmistakable whamp, whamp, whamp of rotor blades echoed through the air. Heads turned. Phones came out. The sun caught the chopper's sleek curve as it emerged over the hill. Trevor at the controls. I raised my arm, signaling the approach. Karen actually backed into her yard like the sky was falling. The Bell 206 came in slow, graceful, descended over my house like an angel of mechanical justice, and touched down with a whisper of wind. I gave a sharp nod, and Trevor shut her down. I could see Karen on her porch, mouth wide open, clutching her latte like it might protect her. I walked over and opened the side door for my guest. Trevor hopped out grinning. Nice spot. Better view than half the helipads I've been on. I turned and looked across the cul-de-sac at Karen, who was frozen like a statue. I waved. Morning, Karen. Hope the noise wasn't too unsightly. She didn't respond, just went inside and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the porch furniture. The neighborhood, meanwhile, erupted into low cheers and stunned laughter. The man with the teenage son brought him over to meet us, and Trevor showed him around the cockpit. More than a few people snapped photos. The best part, everything had been done legally, calmly, and without a single raised voice. The first landing was done. The statement was made. But it wasn't over. Karen had taken this to a personal level, and now that I'd shown her what a real landing looked like, I had no doubt she'd try to fight back. I'd seen her kind before, but I also knew something else. No matter how hard she pushed, I was ready to fly circles around her. The Monday following the helicopter landing felt different. The air was still, but the atmosphere in the neighborhood was electric. I took my morning walk as usual, coffee in hand, but now every neighbor I passed gave a knowing smile or a thumbs up. A few people stopped to ask questions about the chopper, like I'd become some kind of local aviation celebrity. One woman said her son had started looking up pilot schools after watching the landing. A retiree named Phil, who normally barely grunted at anyone, actually tipped his cap and said, "That was the most excitement we've had since the 4th of July parade got canceled." The mood was shifting. For once, the fear of the HOA was loosening its grip, and it was all thanks to a legal, non-aggressive act of defiance that Karen never saw coming. Of course, she didn't stay quiet for long. By that afternoon, she had already posted a furious letter on the HOA bulletin board titled "The Psy Menace and Its Consequences." It was printed in bold, with words like terrorize, dangerous aircraft, and public nuisance scattered throughout. She even claimed I'd violated the community's airspace agreement, which isn't a real thing. I overheard her telling someone at the mailbox that she was in contact with the FAA, the mayor, and a flight safety attorney. She didn't name any of them, probably because they didn't exist. What she didn't realize was that everything about my setup had been documented, signed, and approved. I wasn't some hothead trying to make noise. I was surgical. And the harder she tried to spin it into chaos, the more ridiculous she looked. Still, that didn't mean I was going to relax. Karen was the type to go down swinging, and I had no doubt she'd start throwing everything she could at me, hoping something would stick. Sure enough, 2 days later, I came home to find a city inspector waiting on my property. He was polite but firm, said he received a complaint about unlicensed construction in the backyard. I walked him over to the landing pad, handed him the permit folder, and watched him scan through it with a mix of boredom and mild amusement. After a 10-minute walkthrough, he thanked me and said, "You're good to go." Honestly, I think she just wasted both our time. That evening, Karen pulled her next stunt. She marched around the neighborhood collecting signatures for a new motion that would ban any aerial vehicles or aircraft-related activity from HOA grounds. It sounded dramatic, but the key word was grounds. She didn't have jurisdiction over private backyards. When she realized that loophole, she tried to pivot again. She proposed a rule change that would limit noise decibel levels between 8:00 a.m. and 8:00 p.m., specifically referencing rotor-based noise sources. Most people saw through it immediately. One guy asked if that meant they'd have to ban lawnmowers. Another joked that Phil's snoring would violate it. To her credit, Karen wasn't stupid, just stubborn and drunk on power. When the legal channels didn't work, she went for the dramatics. One afternoon, a local reporter showed up on my doorstep, said he'd been tipped off about a renegade pilot disturbing a suburban community. I invited him in, showed him the permits, flight schedule, and even introduced him to a couple neighbors who'd been supportive. He seemed surprised. I offered to take him for a quick loop around the area next time Trevor came by. The story that aired the next night was titled "Veteran Pilot vs. HOA, Who's Really Out of Line," and featured Karen pacing furiously on her porch while my neighbors applauded the helicopter as it took off again. Needless to say, she wasn't thrilled, but her biggest mistake came when she called the police. It was a Saturday morning. I was helping set up some cones for safety near the edge of the lawn, expecting another landing from Trevor about 30 minutes later. Before touchdown, 2 squad cars pulled up, lights off, and 2 officers approached me. Karen stood across the street, arms folded like she was watching a guilty man get hauled off. The officers were professional but clearly confused. They said there had been a report of illegal aircraft activity and threats to neighborhood safety. I calmly handed over my binder of documents, license, flight logs, FAA permits, and the letter from the city zoning board. They reviewed everything carefully, even called in to verify a couple things. After about 15 minutes, one officer came back over and said, "Sir, you're completely within your rights. We're sorry to bother you, but we had to respond to the call." I nodded, thanked them, and asked if they'd like to meet the pilot once he landed. They actually stayed for it. Trevor came in smooth as ever, landed without a hitch, and waved at the officers. They ended up chatting with him for 20 minutes, taking a look inside the cockpit, and eventually shook my hand and left. Karen, still watching from across the street, looked like she'd swallowed a cactus. The fallout from that stunt didn't go Karen's way either. A few neighbors had taken video of the entire encounter. They uploaded it online, adding their commentary about how she was wasting emergency resources and escalating a peaceful situation. The story kept gaining traction. People started making memes. My favorite was a picture of a helicopter hovering above a cartoon Karen screaming into a walkie-talkie with the caption, "Code Red. He's airborne again." Another clip showed her confronting a neighbor with a measuring tape, trying to prove the landing pad was too close to a bush. Someone edited in dramatic music and titled it Karen versus the Bush, Dawn of Delusion. By now, I was flying in once a week, not for the drama, but because I could. It was legal, therapeutic, and it kept my flight skills sharp. Trevor and I rotated landings, sometimes bringing in small loads of supplies, other times just for the fun of it. Neighbors brought out lawn chairs, kids waved little flags, and one guy even printed shirts that said, "Land it like you mean it." We were basically hosting a suburban air show at this point. But while I was winning the public battle, Karen was simmering beneath the surface. I could feel it. The silence between her public tantrums wasn't surrender. It was build-up. She was plotting something else, something pettier and possibly more dangerous. And sure enough, one morning, I found deep scratches across the hood of my Jeep. Not accidental ones, purposeful, deliberate claw marks. No note, no witnesses, no cameras that caught the act. But I knew. She wanted me to feel unsafe, like my victories had consequences. What she didn't know was that this only steeled my resolve. I didn't run to the police. I didn't yell. I documented everything, quietly installed 2 new cameras with night vision, and reinforced my property lines with motion sensors. I contacted my lawyer and added the incident to the growing file on HOA harassment and potential civil claims, because this wasn't just a petty neighbor feud anymore. Karen had crossed into something worse, obsession. She wasn't trying to enforce rules anymore. She was trying to win a war she couldn't control. And I had no intention of letting her forget who she picked a fight with, because if Karen thought a few scratches or scare tactics would ground me, she had another thing coming. I wasn't just defending my Jeep anymore. I was defending the sky. It started at 2:17 a.m. with a chime on my phone, an alert from one of the new motion sensors I'd installed around the backyard. I rubbed my eyes, opened the security app, and stared at the grainy black and white footage. The night vision filter made everything ghostly, but I could clearly see a figure moving across the edge of the helipad. Whoever it was crouched down, spray can in hand, and started painting something on the surface. A second figure stood nearby, clearly acting as lookout. I zoomed in and caught a blurry flash of a curly blonde bun and a pink hoodie. Karen. Of course it was Karen. I didn't move immediately. I watched the footage for another few minutes, confirming the vandalism, documenting their faces, and noting the time. Then I quietly got dressed, slipped outside through the side door, and recorded the aftermath up close without alerting them. By the time I stepped back inside, they were gone. The next morning, I walked outside as if nothing had happened. My neighbors, who had once tiptoed around HOA politics, were now openly taking sides, and more of them were drifting toward mine. I stood at the edge of the helipad, camera rolling, panning over the giant dripping red letters that now defaced the landing mat. They read, "No-fly zone," in big, uneven strokes, like a child trying to spell doom with finger paint. I turned the camera on myself and said, "Guess some people didn't get the memo about federal air rights. Stay tuned." Then I walked inside, clipped the footage, and sent it straight to my lawyer. By noon, I had the police on site. This time, they didn't need convincing. Between the motion sensor footage, the spray paint evidence, and the history of reports I'd already filed, they had enough to open an official investigation into vandalism and trespassing. One of the officers even commented that I had the cleanest documentation he'd ever seen in a neighborhood dispute. They took statements, collected samples from the paint, and promised to follow up. As the patrol car pulled away, Karen watched from across the street with arms crossed and sunglasses on, pretending to water a bush that had been dead for 3 months. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. But the fallout came quickly. Words spread fast, and the same neighbors who had cheered during the helicopter landings were now visibly angry. People were tired of the drama, tired of the threats, and tired of Karen. The next HOA meeting was standing room only, and for the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, it felt like the majority had finally found their voice. The crowd didn't even wait for Karen to call the meeting to order. A neighbor named Monica stood up and said, "We're done. We want to vote now." Karen tried to protest, claimed it was illegal procedure, that the board needed notice, but someone in the back shouted, "So give us the notice. We'll be back tomorrow." Another voice said, "Or we just call the state attorney general and ask how you've been running this HOA without elections." Karen fumbled for control, but it was already gone. That night, half the board resigned. The other half scheduled an emergency re-election meeting for the following week. Karen had always ruled by fear and silence, but once the silence broke, it was like watching a dam collapse. Neighbors who had never spoken up were now openly sharing horror stories, fines for bird feeders, complaints about driveway chalk, threats for leaving trash cans visible for more than 12 minutes after collection. Someone even read aloud an email Karen had sent demanding that children not shriek or laugh excessively outdoors after 6:00 p.m. It was absurd, and everyone knew it. Still, Karen wasn't finished. The following weekend, as I prepped for another landing, I noticed something odd near the edge of the pad. Folding chairs, orange cones, a flimsy "Do Not Enter" sign zip-tied to a garden stake. It looked more like a toddler's attempt at crowd control than an actual blockade, but I knew exactly who had put it there. It was a desperate move, a last-minute stunt to make it look like the community had rejected the helicopter use. I considered moving the cones myself, but instead, I made a call. 10 minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled up again. I waved them over, explained the situation, and showed them the permit. The officers didn't just clear the blockade, they actually helped me move it off the lawn. I thanked them, and one of them laughed and said, "Honestly, this is way more fun than writing speeding tickets." A small crowd had gathered again, phones out, cheering as the helicopter came in low and landed cleanly right in the center of the pad. Karen stood across the street, glaring so hard I thought she might melt her sunglasses. That night, I flew a low hover over the neighborhood, not too low, just enough to catch everyone's attention, and trailed behind the chopper a long banner that read, "Parked enough." It wasn't petty, it was poetry. The same woman who said, "My Jeep didn't belong in a driveway," was now watching a flying billboard pass over her house. Neighbors laughed. Some clapped. One guy filmed it and uploaded the video with the caption, "When HOA Karen says, no parking, so you upgrade." But even with Karen losing her grip, I didn't stop preparing. I knew she'd try one last attack, something legal or dramatic or both. Sure enough, I got a letter in the mail 2 days later, a formal cease and desist notice drafted by a lawyer. It accused me of harassment, intimidation, and violation of unspecified airspace norms. It was laughably vague and filled with errors, and my own attorney, who had been enjoying the saga more than he admitted, called me and said, "This thing wouldn't hold up in front of a kindergarten teacher, let alone a judge." Still, I took it seriously. We filed a formal response listing every permit, law, and video log supporting my case. Then we added a counterclaim, harassment, defamation, and property damage, with photo evidence of the vandalism and a witness list that included 5 neighbors. Karen hadn't just lost the battle. She was losing the war, and she was doing it to herself. In the following days, I noticed something strange. Karen's prized flower bed out front was being neglected. Her once pristine lawn was browning at the edges. She stopped patrolling in her golf cart. For the first time, she looked tired, not just defeated tired, worn out, like a balloon slowly losing air. It didn't give me pleasure. It just confirmed what I already knew. People like Karen don't operate well when the spotlights shift. She wasn't interested in community harmony. She was interested in control. And now that control was slipping. I didn't celebrate. I stayed calm, professional, focused, because the war wasn't over, not yet. Karen still had influence, still had some supporters, and there was one final vote approaching that would determine the future of this entire neighborhood. One more chance for her to claw her way back into power. But this time, I was ready, because now I wasn't just the guy with the helicopter. I was the guy who made the sky obey. The morning of the final HOA vote dawned calm and silent, like the pause before a storm. I had my usual coffee in hand, watching the dew lift off the grass, the sunlight slowly warming the helipad. My Jeep sat proudly in the driveway, freshly waxed, reflecting the gold of the morning sun like a trophy. I hadn't moved it since the cease and desist letter arrived. The message was clear now. I wasn't going anywhere. And after today, neither was the peace this neighborhood had finally tasted after years of Karen's reign. The community hall was packed by noon. Folding chairs lined the walls, and people stood shoulder to shoulder along the back and aisles. I took a spot near the front, quietly nodding to the neighbors who had stood beside me throughout the chaos. Even those who had remained neutral early on now seemed resolute, energized. There was a buzz in the air, a collective anticipation that something was about to change. Karen entered last, wearing a beige power suit that looked 2 decades out of style. Her hair curled tighter than ever, face set like stone. She clutched her clipboard like a shield, walking stiffly to the board table as if it were a throne under siege. The meeting opened with routine agenda items, but everyone was just waiting for the big one. Finally, the current vice president of the HOA, a man named Greg who had clearly had enough of Karen's antics, stood and addressed the room. Item 12, he said, vote of no confidence in the acting president and board restructuring. Karen immediately stood up and objected. This motion is improper. It hasn't been reviewed by the compliance committee. The crowd murmured. Greg calmly replied, you disbanded the compliance committee 6 months ago, Karen. Remember. The silence that followed was loud. Karen stammered something about procedure and decorum, but it was too late. A neighbor named Monica stood and handed out printed ballots. Another read aloud the proposal. This motion removes the acting president of the HOA and calls for an open vote for a new board, effective immediately upon majority. Simple, clean, legal. The vote wasn't even close. The ballots were collected, counted twice for transparency, and Greg took the microphone. 87% in favor. Karen is hereby removed as HOA president, effective now. The room burst into applause. A few people stood. One guy let out a loud whistle. Karen remained frozen, mouth slightly open, trying to process the reality that her power had just evaporated. She didn't say a word as she walked out. No dramatic speech, no threats, just silence. It was over. For the first time since I moved in, the community felt like a place people actually wanted to live in again. There were cheers outside the hall, neighbors shaking hands, offering thanks, some even hugging. A kid ran up and asked if the helicopter would land again that weekend. I told him, you better believe it. The very next morning, Karen's for sale sign appeared in her front yard. Just like that, she was gone. No farewell notes, no goodbye parties, no last attempts at sabotage. It was almost anticlimactic. She moved out in silence, a moving truck rolling in like a hearse for her failed empire. I watched from my driveway as her furniture was carried out in boxes. One of the movers accidentally knocked over her HOA of the Year plaque, and I admit, I didn't rush to help. She gave me one final glare from her car window as she left, but it didn't carry the fire it once had. It felt more like defeat. After her departure, things in the neighborhood changed quickly. The new board revoked dozens of petty regulations, opened community input forums, and even voted to refund excessive fines from the last year. People brought out decorations for their lawns again. Kids played in the streets without being scolded for running too enthusiastically. It felt like we'd all been holding our breath for years and finally exhaled. To celebrate, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue, inviting everyone, even the ones who had stayed quiet before. Trevor flew in with the helicopter, landed it on the pad just before the grill lit up, and stayed for burgers and stories. We set up a bounce house for the kids, lawn games for the adults, and someone even printed, "Welcome to No Fly Zane t-shirts" as a joke. I wore mine proudly. There were speeches, of course. A few neighbors thanked me for standing up when no one else had, but I reminded them I wasn't the hero. I just had a unique skill set and a stubborn streak. They were the ones who showed up when it counted. The video of Karen's removal and the final vote ended up going viral. Someone had filmed the whole thing and uploaded it under the title HOA Karen Grounded by Helicopter Pilot. Full community revolt. It exploded online. Comments poured in from people sharing their own HOA horror stories, their own battles with overreaching authority, and their joy at seeing someone fight back with brains instead of fists. The banner flavor clip was reposted hundreds of times, some adding dramatic music or slow motion effects. At one point, a national morning show even invited me to speak. I declined politely. This was never about fame. It was about principle. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood settled into a rhythm that felt natural, calm, and friendly. I kept flying in now and then, not to make a statement, but because I enjoyed it. Trevor and I even started offering casual ride-alongs for the neighborhood kids on safe weekends, teaching them about aviation and sharing stories from the field. We turned a battlefield into a runway. From the air, looking down on our little corner of the world, I saw the result of resistance done right, not through shouting or fighting, but through patience, law, and just enough altitude. One day, as I returned from a routine flight, I found a surprise waiting for me on the front lawn. A wooden plaque carved by hand, mounted on a metal stand, with neat engraving that read, "To the man who parked in the sky when the ground got petty. Thank you for helping us breathe again." Underneath, smaller letters added, "Your neighbors." I stood there a while, reading it over, letting the wind from the landing fade around me. It wasn't about the Jeep anymore, or the helicopter, or even Karen. It was about what happens when someone pushes back, not with anger but with clarity, not just for themselves but for everyone watching quietly from behind closed curtains. I never set out to be the spark for a neighborhood rebellion. I just wanted to park my Jeep in peace. But sometimes peace takes a little noise, a little altitude, and a whole lock of nerve. And sometimes, if you can't park it in the driveway, you land it on the lawn.